The following video features clips taken from television that use blackface as a satirical gag. I included these clips not to perpetuate racist depictions of the black image, but to provide context for viewers to better understand my stance on this issue. Over the June 27th weekend, Netflix and Hulu removed the advanced Dungeons & Dragons episode of Community from their streaming services for its use of blackface. This move is understandably controversial, as some would say it allows these companies to paint themselves as advocates to the black community without devoting any actual resources to combat racism. This may be true. Pulling this episode out cost them nothing. They didn't devote any of their time, their money, or effort to show support for Black lives. At best, this is a misguided attempt to do the right thing, and at worst, this is a publicity stunt with no real impact. Either way, this is erasure and censorship, one of the worst forms of content control. But let's focus on what Community actually did. I love this episode. It's one of the best in television, let alone the series. And the episode in question is not about race. It's about bullying. It's about depression, suicide, mental health. It's about a group of people who see someone in need and their efforts to support him. And the reason this episode was pulled from streaming services was for this.
Hey, Neil. This is gonna be awesome, yo.
So we just gonna ignore that hate crime, huh?
No, Shirley, we are not going to ignore this. The argument for why this is acceptable blackface is that it is actually Drowface. That it's not a portrayal of black people, but of a fictional race of elves from a game.
I'm a dark elf, or a drow.
Shouldn't you be wearing armor or something?
I'm an elf, not a nerd.
Whether or not you agree with this argument for its acceptability, and spoiler alert, I don't, this gives us an opportunity to talk about dark elves in fantasy games. Dark elves, or Drow, were originally created with Dungeons & Dragons back in the 1970s. They were created as a separate type of elf with dark skin and white hair, just as Chang portrays them in the episode of Community.
I am Brutalitops, the magician. Magic user, baby, what?
In their descriptions within the game of D&D, this is an entire race of people with dark skin who are evil and meant to be feared. The original artwork of dark elves show them with short, curly hair, further separating them from the normal and good light-skinned elves who have long, straight hair. Later depictions of the Drow, which focused more heavily on their women, show them with longer, more voluminous curly hair that evokes the kind of hairstyles black women wore in the 1970s and 80s. In addition, their more revealing outfits and hypersexualized bodies and poses are in line with the racist fetishization of black women, otherwise known as jungle fever, prevalent in that era, certainly indicating the influence of racist stereotypes on dark elf design. We need to acknowledge that racial biases have informed the creation of Drow in fantasy games, that there are problematic racial overtones in portraying an entire community of dark-skinned people as being evil, while light-skinned people are not. To say otherwise is to be willfully ignorant. And this is a problem that permeates through so much of fantasy role-playing since its beginnings. The literature that inspired Dungeons & Dragons was deeply rooted in racism, from the works of Robert E. Howard and his Conan the Barbarian series to those of H.P. Lovecraft, who, need I remind people, is a notorious racist. These sci-fi, fantasy, and horror serials often drew from their contemporary mainstream concepts of eugenics and white supremacy. There was a certain fascination with otherness as this looming threat, this kind of ideology was imparted to the fantasy role-playing game.
Hello, my friend and brother.
How can I help you, dear madam?
Oh, please, no need for such deference. I'm no better than a gnome.
Yes, you are, madam. You are a human warrior, which is 5 species classes greater than I.
That's disgusting. Don't talk like that.
I am so sorry, madam. Please don't report me for execution.
Oh, no, I didn't mean that. Guys, we've got to do something about these gnomes.
Fantasy races in games are designed with inherent moral alignments and race-based advantages and disadvantages. A fantasy race is arguably a racist fantasy, where the circumstances of your birth determine your ability, personality, intelligence, whether you're good or evil. I understand that in fantasy this is more than a division of skin color between races and more closely resembles a difference in species. A hobbit or dwarf would be differently abled than taller characters, but where fantasy races become problematic is the suggestion that these different races could be monolithically good or evil, intelligent or primitive, cultured or animalistic based purely on their genetic background. No, these fantasy races are not meant to represent real-life minorities, but their descriptions were influenced by the historic denigration of other cultures. I'm not saying that D&D creators Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson were hateful racists, but they had racist and sexist values taught to them through the media and entertainment they consumed. Pulp fiction magazines and literature made by white men, for white men, rife with racist and sexist ideologies. It's an example of what people can call white allergies.
White allergies that by where we were raised and how we were raised in our history growing up, there's certain just imported obvious ways that we're prejudiced in ways that we don't even understand. We got white allergies and may not even know it.
White allergies are the ways white people are unaware of their racist words or actions because their upbringing or their environment makes that kind of racism invisible to them. People with white allergies are the kind you would describe as a product of their time, or that they just grew up differently. It's not an excuse for them, but it helps us understand why they have difficulty acknowledging their wrongdoings. D&D is a product of white allergies. It's a product of invisible systemic racism. That doesn't mean that it's a racist product, but by taking inspiration from racist work, it has a hand in perpetuating a culture of anti-blackness and cultural exploitation. Which brings us back to Community and its use of blackface. Some fans of the show have argued that it isn't a joke on blackface, but a joke on cosplay and the accepted silliness of fantasy role-playing.
If that's sarcasm, I can't tell, because everything in this game is silly.
Chang wasn't pretending to be black, he was pretending to be a drow. It's not offensive, it's silly. Even if Chang was not portraying black people but a fictional race of elves, this is still a portrayal of something with connotations to anti-black sentiments. And the fact of the matter is that the writers of Community chose blackface for a reason. This joke would not have had the same impact if Chang was in whiteface, and he's pretended to be white before, acting as Jeff's understudy for a Greendale commercial.
Understudy!
That's it. That's reality.
This isn't addressed with any sort of disgust or discomfort. Incredulousness, maybe, but it's never shown to be offensive, just silly and weird.
The Dean wants his role to be played by a Chinese man in a blonde wig. Oh my god, you are insane.
Blackface was picked because it's offensive, because it has shock value. Community took something ugly and demeaning and exploited it for a cheap gag. And then it tries to justify the joke by painting it as satire, by demonstrating the discomfort of other characters around this portrayal, and then by removing Chang from the game by killing him. He's being punished and ousted for wearing blackface. This is deserved. This is the appropriate response to those who think it's okay to wear blackface, to humiliate and exclude them. But we wouldn't even be seeing this. We wouldn't be discomforted by this if the writers had elected not to use blackface in the first place. We cannot condone the exploitation of blackface, however satirical the intent. We can't make people who wear blackface look like harmless idiots. We need to acknowledge that blackface is unacceptable and then just not do blackface. Leave it buried in the past where it belongs so that we can see that it's wrong and never have to see it again. But I also think that erasing this content, that censoring it, is not the same as taking responsibility for it. Community producer and distributor Sony Pictures Television only had this to say: "We support the decision to remove the episode," which is devoid of any admissions of potential harm perpetuated by blackface or any support for the black community. It makes me think that this censorship was an attempt on their part to stay ahead of what we call cancel culture or call-out culture, and I think this kind of preemptive action removes the responsibility from the creators to acknowledge their wrongdoings and demonstrate their growth from it. And I think the removal of this episode harms the audience members that need support for their mental health, that are dealing with bullying and depression, that need to hear what this episode has to say. This is a good episode with a positive message about surviving depression that attempted satire and fumbled. And yes, the show writers need to take responsibility for that. The closest official response from people directly involved in the show came from Ken Jeong, who plays Chang, making this apology on his Darkest Timeline podcast.
In 2011, my character Senor Chang on Community depicted a Drow elf from Dungeons & Dragons. I'm truly sorry if this portrayal caused anyone harm, as that was not the intent.
Rather than fearing being called out, we need to be brave enough to call ourselves in. We need to make ourselves aware of our past mistakes and acknowledge them and take ownership of them. We need to be able to have a conversation about it, make a teachable moment about why this was wrong and unacceptable, and bring closure to the affected parties. This is not a new concept for media. Warner Brothers wrote a content warning for their racist Tom and Jerry cartoons. Hangar 13 wrote a content warning for Mafia 3 and its attempt to portray the racism that affected black people in the 1960s. They admitted that the content they created could be harmful and leave the decision to experience that, to have a dialogue about that, up to the audience.
Now, while humor may have been the intent of such caricatures, they also had the effect of revealing society's unfair and hurtful representations of people of color, women, and ethnic groups. Now, some of the cartoons here reflect prejudices that were common in American society, especially when it came to racial and ethnic groups. Now, these prejudices were wrong then, and they are certainly wrong today.
Dan Harmon, creator of Community, has done this in the past on a different issue by making a public and specific apology for sexually harassing and invalidating a female writer on the show, not by being called out by his victim, but by being called in by her.
I betrayed the audience. I destroyed everything. And I damaged her internal compass. I did it all by not thinking about it. So I just want to say, in addition to obviously being sorry, but that's really not the important thing, I want to say I did it by not thinking about it, and I got away with it by not thinking about it. And if she hadn't mentioned something on Twitter, I would have continued to not have to think about it.
She pushed him to do the right thing instead of letting him make himself a coward. She later wrote regarding his apology and her forgiveness, "People should see the good that can happen when you aren't afraid to accept responsibility for your mistakes. He gave me relief, and I hope I was able to give him some in return." Bringing it back to D&D, in the past few weeks, owner company Wizards of the Coast made a commitment to update the racially connotative descriptions and moral alignments of orcs, drows, and other fantasy races in order to better reflect the inclusive space that role-playing is meant to be. Throughout the 50-year history of D&D, some of the peoples in the game, orcs and drow being two of the prime examples, have been characterized as monstrous and evil, using descriptions that are painfully reminiscent of how real-world ethnic groups have been and continue to be denigrated. That's just not right, and it's not something we believe in. This is the kind of action that I think responsible content providers need to be taking, to make a statement of ownership for the harm that they've caused, to preface their content with acknowledgement that what they once thought was right, they now realize is wrong. They need to promise to do better moving forward and then actually do better. And if they refuse to do that, then fucking cancel them. Do you want to support racial justice but don't know how? The first step is always to be educated. Take the time to understand the issues at hand and figure out what is in your capacity to help. Read up on articles on the Black Lives Matter movement, have difficult conversations, and of course, donate to those in need. Thanks for watching. If you made it this far, then please leave a comment below that says,
"For my turn, I feel sorry for Pierce Hawthorne."
And I'll reply with a virtual high five. And if you liked this video, you can show it by giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to my channel for more content. You might be wondering, is this guy gonna be using more community clips in his future videos? And the answer is yes. Anything to keep the show relevant until we finally get that movie.
I can't get erections.
What?